In Racing Through Time, we look at the cars, the drivers, the races and the circuits that made motorsport history. Aston Martin is one of the most famous sports car names. Favoured by wealthy, sports-minded motoring enthusiasts, Aston Martins epitomise exclusive style and power. Aston Martin has also had a long history in motorsport. Their peak years were in the 1950s, as they tried to win the Le Mans 24-hour race. Aston Martin may have had a checkered business history, but the firm has certainly had a glorious racing past. For a company with small resources, they produced classy sports cars. They only raced variations of cars they built for sale to the public, so they weren't in a position to win Le Mans outright until the maximum engine size limit matched the engines that they were building. They used top-line drivers and established the reputation of John Wyer as a team manager par excellence. Aston Martin plays an important part in Racing Through Time. Two of the great names in motoring history are Aston Martin and Lagonda. They came together through the ambitions of one man. Throughout much of the company's history, it's had to struggle against the odds, facing the familiar problems of high production costs with small production volumes. Despite this, the quality of the cars was rarely in question. David Brown was Yorkshire born and bred. He was a member of the famous David Brown Gear Company, founded by his grandfather in Huddersfield. During the 1920s, Brown collaborated with Amherst Villiers, building a supercharger for Raymond May's Vauxhall Villiers hill climb car, which was very successful, holding the hill record at Shelsley Walsh. He collaborated again with Villiers to build a Roots-type supercharger for the 4.5-litre blower Bentleys driven by Sir Henry Birkin. This was a very difficult and precise job. In time, David Brown became involved with Harry Ferguson's tractor concern and soon started building tractors himself. During the 1930s, David Brown became chairman of David Brown Gears. After the Second World War in 1948, he bought Aston Martin and shortly afterwards Lagonda too. In 1951, the David Brown Corporation was formed, with David Brown as chairman. Both Aston Martin and Lagonda had previously enjoyed success in sports car racing, but they had their greatest success with their magnificent victory at Le Mans in 1959. Victory at Le Mans meant so much to a manufacturer in those days. They also won the Sports Car World Championship, the first time it was won by a British team. Racing Through Time looks at the cars that were built and raced during David Brown's time with Aston Martin. How did he become involved?
Well, the way it came about was that I saw an advertisement in the Times newspaper, a sports car company for sale, and after some negotiation I bought it.
With financial support secured, the prototype DB1 was extensively tested by Eric St. John Horsfall, also known as Jock. It was decided that the car would be given the ultimate test and was entered for the 1948 Spa 24-hour race. A brilliant outright win, driven by Jock Horsfall and Leslie Johnson, bode well for the new production car. It was announced at the London Motor Show later that year, described as a 2-litre sports, but later became known as the DB1. David Brown also bought Lagonda and as a result had access to their 2.6-litre 6-cylinder double overhead cam engine, designed by Willie Watson. This engine is usually described as the Bentley engine because W.O. Bentley was chief engineer at Lagonda at the time. Aston Martin engineer Claude Hill resigned after an argument with David Brown when he decided to use the Lagonda engine in the new DB2. It was at the 1948 Spa 24-hour race that David Brown had first spotted John Wyer, who was acting as team manager for the Monaco Motors entry. As soon as Wyer became available, David Brown asked the Kidderminster man to become Aston Martin's team manager for the 1950 season.
Very soon after the beginning, they ran in 1949, and John Easton Gibson was team manager, and David Brown wasn't altogether happy with that arrangement. And then in the beginning of 1950, he invited me, asked me if I'd take over the team management, and I agreed to do that for 1 year. And in the end, I stayed there for 13 years. It was a very long, temporary job.
John Wyer's first job was to build 3 DB2s and prepare them for Le Mans. All 3 were standard, apart from a slightly higher compression ratio and twin exhausts, and all the interior trim was removed. These were to become the famous team cars VMF 63, 64 and 65. Wyer inherited 2 drivers from the previous year, Lance Macklin and Charles Brackenbury. He then signed George Abacassis, Reg Parnell, Eric Thompson and Jack Fairman. The team set out for Le Mans, driving the cars to the race, as was the custom at the time. But on the way, near Rouen, Fairman crashed VMF 65, injuring his wife, who was taken to hospital. In the race, the 1949 car, which had replaced VMF 65 for Eric Thompson, soon retired with a broken crankshaft. But Abacassis and Macklin finished 5th and won the prestigious Index of Performance. Parnell and Brackenbury finished 6th because Brackenbury was not as quick as Parnell. The Le Mans exercise was a belt and braces affair. Only 6 mechanics were taken, and the advertising budget paid for the entire project. After Le Mans, David Brown asked Wyer to join Aston Martin on a permanent basis as Chief Development Engineer. In 1950, Brown decided that the company needed a research and development team, so he employed pre-war auto union designer Professor Robert Eberhahn von Eberhorst. The German started in December 1950 to work on the DB2's successor, the DB3. But it soon became clear that the new car was not going to be ready in time for Le Mans. Wyer built 2 special lightweight DB2s, hoping that he would have 1 DB3 for the race. When it became obvious that this was not going to happen, he took over VMF 64 from the previous year and lightened it as much as possible. The main change between the 1950 and 51 cars was the fitting of 3 double-choke Weber carburetors. This increased the power output to 138 brake horsepower with improved reliability. 1951 is regarded as Jaguar's year at Le Mans, the Coventry firm having sprung a surprise with a new C-Type. While Jaguar opted to go for outright victory, Aston Martin couldn't do this, lacking a sufficiently powerful engine. In view of this disparity in speed, John Wyer decided to set an average lap speed target for each car to achieve for the whole race. After 4 of the 24 hours, the Jaguars were 1, 2, 3, with the first Aston Martin in 10th place. By 12 hours, 2 of the Jaguars had retired, leaving the Walker-Whitehead car in the lead. VMF 64, driven by Macklin and Thompson, moved up to finish in 3rd, within 3 seconds per hour of its target time for the race, and only 9 kilometres behind the Talbot, which finished 2nd. George Abacassis and Brian Shaw-Taylor were 5th, and Reg Parnell and David Hampshire 7th, with 2 private entries, 10th and 13th. With Jaguar winning the event outright and 5 Astons starting and finishing in competitive positions, the effect on the reputation of British engineering, and also exports for Jaguar and Aston Martin, was immense. The team's euphoria might have been tempered if they had known that it would be 4 long years before an Aston Martin would again finish at Le Mans. The long-awaited first appearance of the new DB3 took place in September at the Tourist Trophy at Dundrod, driven by Lance Macklin. In the race, it went reasonably well, and although the twitchy handling gave him some anxious moments, Macklin drove bravely until the Aston developed an oil leak and ran its bearings. Meanwhile, George Abecassis had retired with clutch problems. Jaguar's win in the Tourist Trophy emphasised the rivalry between them and Aston Martin, which was to be a feature of British sports car racing throughout the 50s. Peter Collins had started racing Cooper 500s and had then joined the HWM team in Formula 2, replacing Stirling Moss. He had pestered John Wyer for a drive in the Aston Martin team, and eventually Wyer agreed. Interestingly, both men were from Kidderminster.
For some time before he and John had their first interview, everywhere we went, there would be a scrabbling on the floor, and underneath the table, we would look, and there would be Peter Collins underneath the table trying to attract our attention. You see? And after this had happened about 6 times, he did indeed attract our attention. And he went to see John. Of course, you know the story from there.
The Monaco Grand Prix that year was for sports racing cars and had a good entry. This was the first appearance of a new 2.9-litre engine from Aston. In the race, Reg Parnell was the first to hit trouble with the new engine when on lap 18, a conrod came through the side of the engine and he spun off on his own oil. This occurred at Saint-Devote and caused a huge accident involving half the field, including the race leader Stirling Moss in the C-Type and Robert Manzon. Lance Macklin retired also with a broken conrod, and Peter Collins was classified 7th, although his engine blew up as he crossed the finishing line. Now the team was in a mess, 3 weeks before Le Mans, with 3 blown engines and 1 car very heavily damaged. The shunted car was taken to Paris for repairs, and new 2.6-litre engines were flown out for the other 2 cars. A new coupe-body DB3 was brought out to replace the damaged car. Further troubles followed when Pat Griffiths left the road in practice and damaged DB3/4. This meant that Reg Parnell's car was hurriedly repaired in Paris, taken to Le Mans and substituted for the damaged one, and no one noticed this contravention of the rules. Le Mans in 1952 was to be a disappointment for all the British teams. The Works Jaguar C-Types were in terrible trouble with overheating and all retired within a few hours of the start. Aston Martin had troubles of their own, embarrassingly, with the David Brown-built hypoid rear axle unit. First to retire was the Parnell-Thompson car with a seized rear axle, then the Griffiths-Poor car. The Collins-Macklin car lasted the longest, running for over 20 hours and lying 3rd behind the 2 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLs, until it too suffered rear axle failure. It was particularly galling to David Brown that the team's downfall should have been the rear axles made by his own company. On the team's return to the factory, the engines were fitted with offset big ends, which proved a satisfactory solution to the conrod troubles. The first real test of the 2.9-litre engine was at the first Goodwood 9-hour race in August. The Works Jaguar C-Types went into the lead at the start, followed by the Astons and Roy Salvadori and Bobby Baird's Ferrari. The Parnell DB3 came into the pits. While Fred Lown refueled the car, Jack Sopp and John Wyer investigated a suspected oil leak. Some of the fuel was spilt and ignited by hot oil in the undertray. In the resulting fire, Lown, Sopp and Wyer suffered burns and were taken to hospital. Reg Parnell took over as team leader and masterminded a superb victory for Peter Collins and Pat Griffiths, with the Salvadori Ferrari 2nd after a determined drive. Jaguars had trouble of their own and dropped back, leaving the way clear for the Aston Martin victory. But the older DB3 was now becoming uncompetitive, too big and too heavy. Again, it was Willie Watson who came up with the solution, building the new car which came to be known as the DB3S. A new, lighter and lower chassis was built, although the engine, gearbox and suspension were the same as the DB3. To overcome the rear axle problems, the team requested that David Brown's Huddersfield factory design and make a new spiral bevel unit with a light alloy case. David Brown himself gave the go-ahead for the project, and the first prototype was built and ready for testing in May 1953. The team then went off to Italy for the Mille Miglia, testing a squad of DB3s for Parnell, Collins and Abecassis. The team stayed at the home of Count Maggi, the grand patron of the Mille Miglia and one of the founders of the race. The 1953 Mille Miglia had a strong field of Ferraris, Alfa Romeos, Lancias and Maseratis, besides the British teams from Jaguar and Aston Martin. In the 1,000-mile dash around Italy, the Ferrari and Alfa teams fought out a tremendous battle, which eventually became a duel between Fangio's Disco Volante Alfa and Giovanni Marzotto's Ferrari. The Ferrari won after Fangio drove the last 100 miles with steering to only one front wheel. Meanwhile, Peter Collins, who had initially been in 5th place, had fallen back, eventually finishing 16th with a very battered car. Abecassis had crashed near Florence and retired. Reg Parnell finished 5th, which was the highest place a British car ever finished in the Mille Miglia. He completed the last quarter of the race, from Florence back to Brescia, with a broken panhard rod mounting, so the de Dion axle had no lateral location at all. The car also suffered from a broken throttle, which he controlled on the ignition. It was an amazing performance and one of Parnell's greatest races. Le Mans was chosen for the debut of the DB3S. The entry for Le Mans in 1953 was one of the strongest ever, with works teams from Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Talbot, Maserati, Gordini, Cunningham, Lancia, Nash Healey, Allard, Jaguar and Aston Martin. The works Jaguar C-types, after an initial battle with the Ferrari team, finished 1st, 2nd and 4th, with a Cunningham in 3rd. The Astons were in trouble from the start. Parnell uncharacteristically crashed at Tetra Rouge on lap 17. Abecassis had to retire, having cooked the single-plate clutch. The steadily driven DB3S of Poor and Thompson, holding 14th place, was eliminated by valve trouble on Sunday morning. Le Mans in 1953 was a triumph for Sir William Lyons and Jaguar, but a very disappointing result for David Brown and Aston Martin. '53 saw the debut of Roy Salvadori with the Aston team. John Wyer had been impressed by his performance in the previous year's Goodwood 9-hour race. Roy stayed with the team until the end of Aston's Grand Prix programme in 1960, becoming Aston's longest-serving driver. Everybody liked Roy. He was a good team member and a great driver, very fast, but not endowed with mechanical sympathy in his early years. The next race on the calendar was the 1953 Goodwood 9-hour. The Astons were now more competitive against the Jaguar C-types.
The Jaguar was a very, very good car, very reliable. I suppose more reliable than the Aston, simply because it had a larger engine and they didn't have to stress it so much. You have to remember that the Aston was 3-litre. We were competing against the 3.5, 3.8 Jag, 4.5-litre Ferraris. So, it was asking a lot of the 3-litre engine. So, therefore, the Jag was a much more reliable car. Didn't have the road holding. I didn't like the brakes. It had the power-assisted Dunlop brakes. They weren't as good, in my opinion, as the Aston brakes. But they're a jolly good car. Lazy car, you could pass cars on the straight. And with an Aston, it was all tricky stuff. You had to really stretch yourself in corners. It wasn't always so simple as it seems. And you had to it's just not passing a Jaguar, the corner before the straight wouldn't do you any good. You had to pick it up 3 or 4 corners before a straight so that you could gain enough to hold it off. It was very tricky, the Aston Martin Jaguar competition. 3
Astons were entered against a full works Jaguar team. The Jaguars led at the start, and Salvadori soon retired with a hold crankcase. The Moss and Hamilton Jaguars were in the lead. Parnell and Griffiths both had punctures on their Astons. With an hour to go, disaster struck the Jaguar team when both of their leading cars retired with blown engines. This led the Parnell-Thompson car into the lead, which it held to the flag, followed by Collins and Griffith in second place. After their triumph at Goodwood, the team went to Dundrod for the TT, which was won after a great drive by Peter Collins and Pat Griffith, with Parnell and Thompson second. For David Brown's team, 1953 marked an important transitional year. The team had to concentrate on British events, but for 1954 they were overambitious and saw total failure. '55 was to be one of the great seasons in sports car racing. The dominant make was Mercedes-Benz with its 3-litre straight-8 300 SLR, a direct development of the Formula One W196 car, designed by Rudolf Uhlenhuth, superbly prepared and organised by team manager Alfred Neubauer. Jaguar, as always, concentrated on Le Mans with Malcolm Sayers' aerodynamic D-type, with plenty of power from the punchy 3.4-litre six-cylinder engine, the perfect Le Mans contender. Ferrari raced the very fast but very unreliable 4.4-litre six-cylinder, and for once it was not to be Ferrari's year. This was the opposition that faced Aston Martin with their 3-litre engine, unable to compete for overall honours. During 1955, John Wyer was appointed Technical Director of Aston Martin Lagonda with full responsibility for engineering policy. For 1955, Parnell, Salvadori and Collins were joined by Peter Walker. At the International Trophy at Silverstone, Hawthorn and the Jaguar led from the start and seemed uncatchable, until the top radiator hose blew and he quickly dropped back. As a result, Parnell won with Salvadori second, Collins seventh and Graham Whitehead eighth. The following day, Paul Freer won a sports car race at Spa in Belgium in a production DB3S. Aston Martin had a formidable entry at Le Mans, 3 DB3S cars together with a V12 Lagonda. Their performance was overshadowed by the Battle of the Titans and the tragedy. Initially, the race was led by Castellotti's Ferrari, but as the race progressed, it became a battle between Hawthorn's Jaguar and Fangio's Mercedes. At 6:30 p.m, the horrific accident occurred when Pierre Levesque's Mercedes collided with Lance Macklin's Austin Healey in front of the pits and was launched into the crowd, killing more than 80 spectators. Meanwhile, Collins and Salvadori were having their own internal Aston team race, a furious dice out of the sight of John Wyer. The Lagonda retired after 93 laps, out of fuel on the circuit. Salvadori and Walker retired with a broken crankshaft after 106 laps. After Mercedes-Benz withdrew during the night, the Jaguar of Hawthorn and Boerb went on to victory. The remaining Aston DB3S of Collins and Freer lasted the distance. In 1955, the British Grand Prix was held at Aintree and the David Brown team was out in force, with 4 cars entered against 1 works Jaguar for Mike Hawthorn in the supporting sports car race. Hawthorn led before he fell back with a leaking fuel union, allowing the Astons to come through to take the first 4 places in the order Salvadori, Collins, Parnell and Walker. This triumph was witnessed by a happy David Brown. In 1955, the third and last Goodwood 9-hour race was held on the Sussex circuit. Hawthorn's Monza Ferrari led away, pursued by Jaguars and Aston Martins. Parnell retired his Aston after only 3 laps with a broken hub. Tony Rolt retired his D-Type in his last race, and Hawthorn lost a lot of time in the pits. For the rest of the race, there was a good battle for the lead between the Ecuria Cost D-type of Titterington and Sanderson and the Collins Brooks and Walker Poor Astons. Titterington left the track avoiding a slower car and broke a headlight, which slowed him down later in the race. When the Jaguar made its last pit stop, Walker went into the lead, which he held to the finish. The Jaguar was second and Collins and Brooks third, making a hat trick of 9-hour wins for Aston Martin. The 1955 Tourist Trophy at Dundrod attracted the best entry yet at a British sports car race. With the Astons up against a full team of Mercedes 300 SLRs driven by the likes of Moss and Fangio, plus Mike Hawthorne's D-Type, it was important to get a good start. Moss was increasing his lead from Hawthorne. Collins was driving one of his best races and coming up through the field in fine style. After the pit stops, Titterington led in the D-Type, which he shared with Hawthorne, followed by the Mercedes. Collins, who got as high as third, had a long pit stop before handing over to Tony Brooks. The car was soon to retire with a broken conrod bolt. Moss retook the lead from Hawthorne, who retired right at the end of the race. The Walker Poor Aston finished fourth after a steady drive, and the Parnell Salvadori car was seventh. It had been a commendable effort by the Aston team. Peter Collins was the undoubted star, his drive up to fourth place one of his most brilliant performances. This led to him being offered a drive by Mercedes-Benz for the Targa Florio and a Grand Prix career with Ferrari. Tony Brooks was a rising star in the Aston Martin team. At the end of 1955, the DB3S had reached the limit of its development, so the team started to work on its replacement, the DBR1. Meanwhile, the DB3S would have to continue during 1956. Two significant things happened in 1956. Firstly, as a result of the Le Mans disaster, the 24-hour race was postponed until July so that additional safety work could be carried out. New regulations were introduced, reducing the engine size for prototypes to 2.5 litres. Production sports cars had no capacity limit, but 50 had to be built, and a maximum fuel consumption of 10.8 miles per gallon was also imposed. The other major event in 1956 was the arrival of Stirling Moss to drive for the Aston Martin team. For the 1956 season, Peter Collins had joined Ferrari for Grand Prix races. Although he continued to drive for Aston Martin in sports car races, in John Wyer's view, he didn't give of his best. Moss and Salvadori were race winners early in the season at Goodwood and Silverstone. Unfortunately, Salvadori sustained injuries in an accident in his Maserati, and at the Nürburgring he was far from fit, but partnered Peter Walker. Brooks was alongside Collins. Moss was contracted to Maserati for this race. The Astons handled very badly at the ring due to the shock absorbers fading on the long circuit with its very rough surface. Collins drove a very lackluster race, outperformed by his teammate Brooks, who drove superbly on his first visit to the Nürburgring. Roy Salvadori, still recovering from his serious accident at Silverstone, and Peter Walker were holding fourth place, one lap from the end, when the De Dion tube broke, putting Roy into a ditch and into hospital again. This left the Collins-Brooks car to finish fifth. At Le Mans, the new DBR1 was unveiled to be driven by Parnell and Brooks. The DBR1 was a different concept altogether. Designed by Ted Cutting, it had a small diameter tubular space frame. The 5-speed gearbox was combined with the rear axle. When it first raced in 1956, the capacity was 2,493 cc's for the prototype class. The engine was later enlarged to 3 litres with twin spark plugs, and it produced 240 brake horsepower. Although similar to the DB3S engine, its light alloy block had more scope for development. Le Mans in 1956 was a good race for Aston Martin. The Jaguar D-Type didn't have its usual advantage, and the combined driving abilities of Moss and Collins, with something to prove, kept the Aston competitive. Jaguar had 2 cars eliminated early in the race when they crashed in the S's. Unfortunately, Peter Walker crashed the second DB3S he shared with Salvadori under the Dunlop Bridge, injuring himself. The Hawthorne Buick D-Type was held up with fuel injection problems and only finished 5th after a long chase. Moss and Collins had a race-long battle with the Ecuria-Cost D-Type of Ron Flockhart and Ninian Sanderson. Moss led for long periods before he lost the use of second gear, allowing the D-Type to pull away to win. Meanwhile, the DBR1 had been running reliably in 4th place until it ran its bearings very late in the race.
I was driving with Reg Parnell and the car went beautifully and held the road extremely well, but unfortunately it expired after about 22 hours, which is fairly hard at Le Mans. If you go out early, well, you say, well, bad luck. At 22 hours, you say 1 or 2 other things as well.
1956 had been the swan song of the DB3S. It had been the frontline Aston over 4 years. At the end of 1956, David Brown made John Wyer general manager of Aston Martin Lagonda to replace James Sterling, who had retired and emigrated to Canada. John Wyer's promotion meant that he had to find a new team manager. The ideal replacement came along when Reg Parnell decided to retire from driving and quickly accepted the post of team manager when David Brown offered it to him. To help Parnell cope with the paperwork of his new job, John Wyer hired Gillian Harris. She had studied at the Lycée and spoke perfect French. She was to become Reg's chief of staff, responsible for all planning. In addition to running the racing side of Aston Martin, John Wyer now had to oversee production of customers' cars. Unlike Jaguar, Aston Martin had no cars to protect itself from obsolescence. Despite a disastrous factory fire, the new 2.4 and 3.4-litre Jaguar saloons gave the Coventry firm a new string to its bow. In contrast, the only 4-door DB saloon, the 3-litre Lagonda, was on the point of being dropped. No longer could good looks and performance offset high price and poor passenger accommodation. David Brown decided that Wyer should embark on a world tour to drum up sales, while a cosmetic job was carried out on the DB2/4 Mark II. With a few minor improvements, it became the DB Mark III. Early in the year, 2 DB3S cars were entered for the Empire Trophy at Alton Park. Roy Salvadori had a great battle with Archie Scott Brown in the works Lister Jaguar, having to give best to the talented Lister driver on this occasion. This was the start of a series of great battles between the Astons and the Listers. The DBR1s had won the Sports Car Grand Prix de Spa, driven by Tony Brooks, who excelled at Spa, with Salvadori second. Next came one of the most important of Aston Martin's victories, the 1,000 kilometres at the Nürburgring.
Noel Cunningham-Reid and I drove the car, and it was really a tremendous race, a very exciting race. I think the DBR1 showed off best at the Nürburgring because it was such a superb handling car. Although it didn't have a lot of top-end power compared with the competitors, it had good torque. And that, combined with superb road holding and braking at the Nürburgring, gave us a wonderful tool to win the race. It really was an excellent car on the ring, and a very, very satisfying race to win.
In this dramatic race, the DBR1 came of age. After this encouraging start, the team went to Le Mans. After their overreaction in 1956, the organisers reversed their policy and dropped the restriction on engine capacity and fuel consumption. This suited Ferrari and Maserati, who entered big 4 and 4.5 litre cars. Aston Martin entered 2 DBR1s and a new car, the DBR2. This was fitted with a racing version of the new Tadek Marek designed engine, destined to be fitted to the DB4 road car. Because the DBR2 was not developed, it was entrusted to the Whitehead brothers, Peter and Graham. They realised straight away that this car was something special. In the race, both DBR1s retired with gearbox trouble, which was to be a recurring problem with the new transaxle design. Tony Brooks had crashed his car at Tetra Rouge whilst trying to change gear. The DBR2 was running well, although down on power due to a mix-up with the fuel system. It too retired with gearbox trouble when the breather pipe became blocked and all the oil was pumped out. David Brown again had the unpleasant sight of watching a Jaguar victory at Le Mans, while his cars all retired with gearbox problems. However, apart from the Le Mans debacle, 1957 had been quite successful with the big win at the Nürburgring. The CSI decided that the World Sports Car Championship would be restricted to an engine capacity of 3 litres. As Aston Martin already had the fastest 3-litre car, they thought that they had a good chance of success. The CSI's decision was to affect another of David Brown's projects, the DBR4, his new Formula One car. This had been built during the 1957 season. Brown was getting restive about the success of Tony van der Velde's Van Wall team. Hence the DBR4, which was derived from the DBR1 with a narrower chassis and a 2.5-litre version of the RB6 engine. David Brown reluctantly had to agree that the sports cars came first and the DBR4 was put under wraps for another year. That decision was to prove crucial to the future of the DBR4, which missed a year's development and racing. Aston Martin were back in luck in 1958. Maserati withdrew from racing at the end of 1957, which allowed Stirling Moss to rejoin the team. At the Nürburgring, the team won the 1,000 kilometres again, this time with Moss and Jack Brabham at the wheel. Stuart Lewis Evans was a member of the team. He was fast but not physically strong. He just wasn't strong enough to be a long-distance driver. He could last a Grand Prix, but was in a very bad way at the Nürburgring and had to hand over to Tony Brooks. At Le Mans in 1958, the Aston team failed. Stirling Moss led the race easily for the first 30 laps until his engine blew up. Lewis Evans crashed his car, and the Brooks Trintignant car retired with gearbox troubles once more. The Whitehead brothers, in their private DB3S, came to the factory's aid, bringing their old car, which had finished second back in 1955, into second place once again. The highlight for the year was the announcement at the Paris Motor Show of the new DB4. This was an instant success. Unfortunately, the car was rushed into production and suffered from a lack of proper development in 1959 and 1960. David Brown decided that the team really must win at Le Mans at what was to be their 10th attempt in 1959. They carried out a lot of testing to make sure that they would win. But these plans were soon changed when their American importer persuaded them to send a car to Sebring for Salvadori and Carroll Shelby. This car led the race until Salvadori handed over to Shelby. Soon after, it retired with a number of problems, including a broken gear lever. After a depressing time during the Le Mans test days in April, the team went back to the factory to put a number of things right. Moss had persuaded Wyer to lend him a car to drive in the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometre race. Moss was lent the car, Reg Parnell and 2 mechanics. He needed a co-driver and took Jack Fairman. However, Fairman put the car into a ditch, avoiding a slower car, and lost a lot of time. Moss took over again and drove one of his great races, retaking the lead to win the race for Aston Martin for the 3rd consecutive year. After this inspired drive, the team went off to Le Mans quietly confident.
Following from the examples that have been set over the years previously by John Wyer when he was team manager, it was very closely programmed. Every race that we went to, there was a very tight schedule. It was always printed out. We communicated with everybody we possibly could in written form so that they knew when the plane left, when the boat left, where the cars had to be, who was driving the cars. The drivers knew the arrangements, the mechanics knew the arrangements, really so that there was as much information as possible. And then during the actual race, I had a typewriter there, and I kept each day there would be a daily movement schedule so that people would know what was going on.
It was decided that the Moss-Fairman car would attack the Ferraris and try to overstress them at the beginning of the race. Sterling led the race for the first hour and then stayed with Bayer's Ferrari, being only 10 seconds behind it after 2 hours. After 4 hours, the car, now driven by Fairman, blew its engine. It had done its job, however, as the fastest Ferrari retired soon after. This left the Salvadori Shelby Aston in the lead.
I had a terrible vibration in the car, and I thought, my God, the gearbox is playing up again. And then it disappeared, and then it returned. They got worse and worse, and I thought, well, I better call in and talk to Reg. I think we'll have to retire the car. I thought the gearbox, the Aston Martin gearbox, was giving trouble again. I called in the pits, and they examined the car, and they put it on jacks, revved the back up, and just said, well, there's nothing we can find that's wrong, just go out and go slow until you have to come in for your refueling. There was a restriction there, I believe it was 30 laps before you were allowed to refuel. So I went out for another 2 laps, it was terrible. Called in, I think, on another 2 occasions, was told to go out to finish my 5 laps. And we were literally crawling around. And then I pulled in at the correct time, 30 laps from memory, and got out of the car to hand over to Carol. They jacked the car up and found that one of the tyres was falling apart, and they'd lifted the tread. It was eventually found that a piece of metal had got under the tyre and was causing this violent vibration. I wouldn't have thought it possible. I thought the whole car was going to fall to pieces. And I got a rocket from Reg Parnell because I'd misled them by telling them that I thought it was the gearbox. And that was our problem, but it lost us about 15, 20 minutes.
The 2 Astons were now being driven hard to catch up, while the leading Ferrari began to have overheating problems. Shortly after 10 a.m., the Olivier Gendebien Phil Hill Ferrari made an unscheduled pit stop and retired with an overheated engine. The 2 Astons now led the race in first and second positions.
The story got around that we backed into that race, that we only won because Ferrari lost. That's quite untrue. Those 2, Shelby and Salvadori, led the race for something like 15 or 16 hours of the 24. They were leading far more than people give them credit for. They just made just the right speed to stay there, not to get too far away, not to try and any heroics. And so that when the last Ferrari failed, they were right in a position to win. But really they drove the car so extremely kindly, with great mechanical sympathy.
David Brown finally had the satisfaction of seeing his cars finish first and second at Le Mans.
Luckiest thing that ever happened to Salvador and I, back when Le Mans used to really mean something, in our opinion anyway. We won the race thanks to John Wyer's, not only his intelligence, but his organizing ability. We had a car that was probably 15 miles an hour slower down the straight. Salvador ruined the brakes the first lap. However, in spite of all this, we held her together and won the 24-hour race, and it was the luckiest break up to that time that it ever happened to me because, as I say, it meant something then, and it opened the door for a lot of opportunities for me down the road.
Having set out to win at Le Mans, victory meant that Aston Martin were in with a chance of winning the Sports Car World Championship. To beat their main rivals, Ferrari and Porsche, they had to win the Tourist Trophy at Goodwood and ensure that a Ferrari didn't finish in the top 3. They decided to speed up their pit stops by fitting built-in Jags which used compressed nitrogen. Reg Parnell put his 2 fastest drivers, Moss and Salvadori, in the same car.
I'd hoped that was going to be a good race. It's the first time that I'd been partnered with Sterling. There was a great difference on height, and he was uncomfortable and I was uncomfortable because he had to have a soft cushion behind his back, and I was uncomfortable without any cushion at all. But we went very quickly and led the race, and I think when Sterling handed the car over to me, we were a good half lap in the lead, and then when I handed back to Sterling, we had, I think, a lap. We were certainly a lap in the lead. And then they set fire to me. And that was the end of it all.
The car caught fire while being refueled and had to be withdrawn. The Aston pits were badly damaged, and very sportingly, Graham Whitehead withdrew his own car to allow the works team to use his pit. Reg Parnell brought in the Shelby Fairman car and put Moss in. Moss drove as only he could and came through to win in style. The Porsche of Joe Bonnier and Wolfgang von Trips was second, with the Tony Brooks Dan Gurney Ferrari in third. If Brooks had finished second, Ferrari would have shared the championship with Aston Martin.
Well, the Ferrari had more power, but it didn't have the road holding of the Aston Martin, and I think we felt that to our disadvantage at Goodwood, which was the final round in the championship that year. That was the I don't know whether they call it the TT in those days or not, but anyway, I think the final round was held at Goodwood, where in fact Aston Martin won the World Sports Car Championship and Ferrari lost it. But it was such a tight circuit for the Ferrari and just the circuit for the Aston Martin with its superb road holding. So we were well beaten on that circuit. I think Aston Martin, would be fair to say, deserved to win.
So, Aston Martin had won the 1959 World Championship for sports cars as well as the Le Mans 24 Hours. David Brown enjoys the champagne and celebrates his team's victory. However, shortly afterwards, David Brown announced that Aston Martin was to withdraw from sports car racing. In contrast to the triumph of the sports cars, the Formula One program was a huge disappointment. The Formula One Aston was not a bad car, but in 1959 the team experienced engine lubrication problems and it never delivered full power. In its first race, Roy Salvadori was narrowly beaten by Jack Brabham's Cooper Climax.
I didn't really feel that we had the capacity. The racing department in Aston Martin was really very small. We didn't have an unlimited budget, we didn't have unlimited people. And I felt that to try to do both was a mistake, that we should not, and this is why we postponed the Formula One car, and really we missed it, because by the time we did run the Formula One car, time had passed on and the competition had got much tougher, and we didn't make a great success of it. I felt it was too much for our capacity. We'd do better by concentrating on one or the other.
59 wasn't too bad, to be truthful. We had a couple of good runs and the engine wasn't that reliable. We were having trouble with the engine, so we had to reduce the revs. But it was the 60 season that was disastrous. They changed the suspension, they changed many things on the car, and the car was inferior to the 59 car. I think they made a chassis for a rear engine car, but I think wisely they decided to keep away from it. It would have been too heavy in any case.
Now it was the era of the mid-engined car, and Astons couldn't catch up. They built the new DBR5, which handled even worse than the DBR4, and after the British Grand Prix, David Brown wisely agreed to withdraw. In 1960, Roy Salvadori was sharing a DBR1 with up-and-coming Scottish sports car driver Jim Clark. This was not a works effort, but a privately owned team. They were not able to match the pace of the Ferrari, and it was Olivier Gendebien and Phil Hill who controlled the race from start to finish. The combination of Clark and Salvadori in the Aston took third place at the end of the 24 hours, but the scene was set for Ferrari domination well into the 1960s. On the production side, the DB4 had had a troubled introduction. A crippling strike at the factory had delayed production, and the company was losing money. Aston Martin concentrated their efforts on GT racing in the early 1960s, competing against Jaguar E-Types and Ferrari GTOs in sports car racing across Europe. One VEV and two VEV were the most famous of the 19 Zagato-built DB4 GTs. These were retained by the factory and driven by Jim Clark, Roy Salvadori and Innes Ireland. While the company was racing, David Brown had asked no more than that losses be contained. The publicity for the David Brown Group was considered worth the cost. With the end of racing, all this changed and life at Aston Martin became much more serious in the 1960s. By the 1990s, Aston Martin was under the Ford banner, now a stablemate to their one-time rival Jaguar. Aston Martin still make powerful luxury sports cars and retain an important place in motor racing history and the race through time.